Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all that are joining us today online. My name is Jack Durkee, and I work with the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, where I, among other things, help manage our Arctic infrastructure inventory. I'm excited to introduce and moderate today's panel entitled Overcoming Remoteness, Arctic Innovation in Transportation, Energy, and Connectivity. We are proud to co-host this event with the Wilson Center's Canada Institute as we discuss in particular today the North American Arctic. The dearth of infrastructure in the North American Arctic is a barrier to people that live in the region. Remote communities must prioritize basic services that are often taken for granted in today's integrated, globalized world, and that often weighs heavily on the physical and mental health of these communities. Identifying innovative solutions to help implement transformative infrastructure and finding the funding for such is an urgent issue for the North American Arctic residents, as well as the competitiveness of economic and resource development and the ability to defend and secure the region. Energy, transportation, and communications infrastructure are critical to support these communities and the further sustainable development of the region. None of this is news to those that work or live in the Arctic. Recognizing the infrastructure gap and the unfortunate realities it poses is important, but it's only the first step towards constructive solutions. Understanding that gap is the next step. We hope today's discussion helps build towards that understanding and action. We have three esteemed speakers joining us today. First, in no particular order, we have Dr. Heather Exner-Perot, a Wilson Center Fellow with both the Canada Institute and the Polar Institute here at the Wilson Center. She also serves as Senior Fellow for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. Second, we have Dr. Jessica Shadian, President and CEO of Arctic 360. And third, we have Madeline Redfern, Chief Operating Officer of CanArctic Inuit Networks. You can find more information about each speaker on the event webpage. Before starting the discussion, I want to thank Heather Exner-Perot for her leadership in conceptualizing this event, and I also want to thank the Canada Institute team, Chris Sands, Zavi Delgado, and Zoe Reed, for the help and support in coordinating this event. For those joining the discussion online, you can submit questions for the speakers in the chat box within the web stream. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Heather.
Well, thanks for the warm welcome and introduction, Jack. It's my delight to be here on this stage. I've been here a Wilson Fellow for 4 months, but have been dreaming of my moment to be up here with my esteemed colleagues, Madeline and Jessica, to talk about an issue very close to my heart, Arctic development. And in my 4 months here at the Wilson Center, I've been focusing on the things I care about the most, I guess, Arctic, Indigenous, and resource development. And this webinar and the paper that I'll write as a follow-up to it is really an intersection of all of those things. So I like to think of Arctic development as a puzzle, and what we're trying to do is figure out some of the pieces of how to do it. I think as a political scientist working on Arctic issues for the last 2 decades, it's not a very sophisticated or advanced field. There aren't a lot of academics who focus on Arctic development. It isn't very advanced in policy. It isn't very advanced as a scholarly field. And in many ways, we're still living in the paradigm that we established in the 60s and 70s of a welfare state, and not much more except for maybe some money has come in, to evolve things. And there's some urgent, there's some reasons why we need to start thinking of evolving this and being smarter, and not doing things in quite a haphazard way. And so myself and also Jessica, Madeline, I think of these things probably more than the average person, and how is it to develop in a way that benefits community and the resource sector and security and meets all these different state and industry and community needs. And we have some good ideas. I would say that there have been many innovations in Arctic development on the political side. There have been very unique and transformative political arrangements, but not on the economic side. That, again, I like to call it a stasis. For 40 or 50 years, we've been in the same kind of paradigm. But yet the region has so much potential and so much need. It's also a little bit different from typical economic development puzzles or literature, in that we're really dealing with remoteness. That remoteness is kind of the essence of why Arctic development is a puzzle and why it makes things hard, even in these rich, kind of democracies, that the region itself faces many different barriers. And in talking with Madeline and Jessica in the last few months, have kind of conceptualized what is at the essence of this remoteness, that is this challenge. And it's, the transportation, the energy, and the connectivity, that those things are so difficult in remote contexts that it makes everything more difficult, more expensive, and harder to achieve. The transportation, when we talk about remote communities, it's not, where a rural community would be connected by road, but a remote community does not have year-round access. And that makes food, housing, all kinds of materials just far more expensive. Transportation for medical services, everything. Energy, being off-grid, not having connections to transmission lines or to natural gas pipelines makes energy so much expensive, which just makes the average household that much more expensive to run, makes industrial processes almost impossible, and again, is that extra barrier. And connectivity. In the last 10 years, and certainly with COVID, we've seen how internet connections can really overcome a lot of time and distance. For the Arctic, although this is great potential to overcome this time and distance, in many ways the gap has only gotten bigger because the connectivity isn't that good, because it is unreliable, because it is so expensive. And so trying now to get into the nuts and bolts of what are, we've been thinking about it and talking about it for 40 or 50 years. What can we actually start to do to overcome some of these remoteness problems that we still face in these very rich countries in this region with trillion-dollar potential? And there's obviously urgency. We're coming into an energy transition where we need, according to the International Energy Agency, 6 times more mining input than we have been experiencing. Those critical minerals have to come from somewhere, and they can't come from Russia or China, which currently are the world's #1 and #2 miners. And so looking at a map, where are our allies? Where is NATO? Where is the OECD going to get all of these new critical minerals? And at least part of the answer has to be the Arctic. And yet, resource development companies also face all the same barriers and remoteness as communities do. Dave Baldwin's in the room. The National Strategy for the Arctic region also identifies that critical minerals is a strategic objective of the Americans. It's in the European Union plans. It's in Japanese plans, South Korea plans. Everyone is looking at where to source these critical minerals and looking at the Arctic as a potential source for that. So try to take this dialogue one step further and thinking about what are some near-term innovations that can be transformative, that are possible, isn't just pie in the sky, but does require some kind of coordinated effort, some kind of strategy. And then finally in 2022, we may have some political willingness to impart some strategy on Arctic development. So Madeline will talk about these technologies in turn, and Jessica will talk about the strategy, but thinking in particular about airships as one solution to the problem of transportation in remote places, thinking of small modular reactors as one solution to the problem of energy in remote places, and thinking of fiber networks as in some places the only option, better than where satellite will not do, and fiber will be required for the community needs, for remote work purposes, for security and defense, for monitoring, and all those things. So that is our ambitious agenda for the next hour. And I'm delighted that Madeline and Jessica have made the trip from Canada to join us today, thanks to the Kennan Institute and the Polar Institute. And I'll turn it over to the esteemed Madeline Redfern, who knows more about Arctic innovation and how to actually get things done than anyone else in the world, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you to the Wilson Center for the kind invitation to be able to come before you today. So I'm from Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut, and for those that don't know where that is, I'm situated on Baffin Island, which is next to Greenland. Everyone seems to know where Greenland is in the world. So I'm working in transformative technologies, and interestingly enough, actually the work that I'm doing is intersecting in all these 3 areas, in part because when I was the former mayor for the city of Iqaluit, I learned really quickly that all the issues that my community were facing were primarily due to the lack of infrastructure in telecommunications. If you follow my Twitter feed, you'll often see me tweeting in frustration about, the inability for our community to be able to connect. That's even if my tweet loads, because sometimes it doesn't. It's 100% satellite dependent, and as such, it is slow, it is unstable, it is unreliable, low throughput, and extremely expensive. My home business internet bill often is over $1,000 a month, and that is with a very small monthly data cap. And when I go over that cap, which I often do early in the month, I am literally facing about $100 a day overage charges. That's how I get to $1,000, over $12,000 a month. And that is not a packaged bundle of where I have cable and or cell phone even attached to that. So it's a massive, massive barrier. And despite the Government of Canada's significant investments to try to improve our connectivity, we went from having 5 megabits download speed to 15. And I can tell you 15 is not what any of you want to be dealing with. It is not the current necessity of speeds for most of the applications. So whether you need to do an update on a software like Microsoft application, I mean, those are my sort of daily frustrations, is just like, no, I have to wait until I go down south to be able to do those updates. The reason why I think subsea fiber optic cable is absolutely necessary is that while we are seeing the development of LEOs, and LEOs are great in so much as it's better, as Elon Musk says, than nothing. But it does not replace fiber with respect to the sheer amount of data and throughput and speed and ability to actually grow a digital economy, which we so desperately need. So I often liken that as, to the difference of having, arteries as your fiber optic throughput, and the capillaries or LEOs and satellite, are good for sort of just managing the very remote regions, boats, airlines, and maybe the smallest communities. But we really do need and want to see significant advancements in fiber optic networks. We're seeing that in Alaska, with Quintillion, who's built out, and others. We've seen that in Greenland with 2 fiber optic cables, in Iceland, in the Nordic countries. It literally, without fiber, you are going to hold back economic development in that region. But you can't do fiber without having the energy solutions as well. You need a stable, reliable, abundant, and affordable energy as well in our communities to be able to not just power, the electricity, but to also as a potential offset for heating. We're 100% diesel dependent in Nunavut and approximately 177 Indigenous communities in Canada. It's huge. And so just to give you a little bit of context, the government of Nunavut spent, past tense, about $220 million a year on bringing in petroleum products for approximately 220 million liters of fossil fuel. About $1 a liter. Well, guess what? With Russia's invasion of Ukraine this past year, we know how much energy security is a big, big issue, and especially the cost of living has gone up with the fuel prices. So even with a 20-cent increase per liter, I mean, that is now adding $44 million plus to our territorial budget just to consume the same amount of fuel. Iqaluit, although being one of 25 communities in our territory, consumes 50% of that petroleum product. That's, approximately $150 million a year. Huge for a population of just 8,000 people. Process that. And yet we hear that, we don't have enough money to replace that diesel, but we have to. I mean, thankfully, the Government of Canada has committed to a goal of net zero, getting all our communities off of diesel by 2050. How are we going to do it? We need to figure out what the energy options and solutions are. And in some cases, yes, hydro may be an option, but you have to have the rivers or the glacier melts, or the large lakes to be able to do so. We don't have that in all our regions or all our communities. Other options might be a little bit of solar, a little bit of wind, but again, it won't completely replace our diesel because it is not sufficiently scalable to replace the baseload power. So another potential option now is the SMR, small modular reactors or micro modular reactors. And I am happy to say is that we're seeing SMRs to be in development of even 500 kilowatts, sort of power unit size, 5 megawatt power unit size, or even Westinghouse and Hitachi of 300 megawatts. So these SMRs actually are an option. We've seen Russia actually do an SMR on a boat. on a ship, and they just kind of bring it into their community, and they plug the community in. And it is abundant. It is a cleaner option, and it is one definitely worth exploring. Again, if you have the abundant energy that is stable, reliable, and affordable, it unlocks all sorts of opportunities, not just plugging in your, let's say, your fiber optic cable, providing electricity and power for the communities, but we also need it for mines that are near our communities. In many cases, like the 2 mines that are in Nunavik, they actually consume more petroleum product than all the communities of that region. That's significant. We also know that De Beers, who has a mine near Iqaluit, it's a diamond type mine, and they want to do it robotically. They want to have the smallest footprint, and they need to basically, a power source, and they need telecommunications in order to do that. And so that combination requires, abundant, reliable power. You can't diamond mine on diesel. You can't do diamond mine on, solar or wind. So they need that power solution that our community does as well. So robotic mining, again, needs telecommunications. So it's interesting to see where there's all these synergies, all these opportunities to basically sort of bring and combine these technological solutions. Last but not least, I guess I'm involved in the airship study. Just do a few things. The Canadian Arctic Innovation Association received funding to do a pre-feasibility study on airships. And the reason why, we're looking at this is that it's so expensive to bring goods up into the Arctic, and we have such a short shipping season. And a lot of times people look at the cost and they're like, oh, the shipping rates don't look that bad. But what you have to factor in is that, someone like me who does sea lift on an annual basis, I have to buy the goods, I have to get them to an expediter, they have to crate them, they have to deliver that crate to the shipping yard, and then the shipping yard, thankfully puts it on the boat and it brings it up, and then they have to unload that crate and deliver to the business or the house. So to contextualize that, if you wanted to ship up a king size mattress to the north, you're probably going to pay about $1,000 for that by airship cargo. You're going to pay about $1,000 to ship it by boat because of all the accessory, ancillary costs that go with it. But when you're talking about construction, the amount of pre-planning that takes, at least about 2 years to get, all the permits and the financing in place, but it takes at least almost a year to book the space on the ship and then get, all the materials, and then it waits at the shipping yard, and you get a short window of time to ship it up from, in my case, about July to October. In some of our communities, it's actually even a shorter window because they only get 1 ship a year. And the cost, as I said, is actually quite significant. But if you miss that ship for that year, for whatever reason, because you didn't book the ship in time and they didn't able to accommodate it, if you forgot to get the materials to the shipping yard in time, there's all sorts of reasons why those factors happen. Then all of a sudden you're having to wait another year, and we don't have hardware stores in most of our communities. Literally, I had a neighbor just sort of a couple weeks ago just freaking out because he wanted caulking, for a new kitchen installation. He's like, and there's no caulking in town, and he's freaking out. And I'm like, well, I have some because I kind of run a little mini hardware store underneath my stairs, it turns out. But nonetheless, it's just so challenging, especially when you're talking about trying to build healthcare centers or schools or gymnasium. It's huge and significant. The ability of an airship would actually, if it works, and this is the whole reason for the feasibility study, is to see, under what circumstances, it could work. Is there a business case for it? So we're looking at places like Shefferville, where it's the end of the rail line, or Churchill, the end of the rail line, or Yellowknife, the end of the road, and then, the possibility of having an airship hub, something similar to like what you would imagine Amazon, kind of like, and then being able to launch, the delivery of large materials, whether it's construction, home office supplies, to give you an idea of, price, because you can probably buy about a 16-kilo bag of dog food here in the States for about $25. In Iqaluit, it's $125. And you have to ship that up, in advance for the whole year. So I have about 12 bags of dog food in my sea container. But the stores have to ship up a whole community's worth of goods for the entire year. The amount of toilet paper, pasta, rice, you get the sense. Like, it's significant amount of warehouse space, amount of money that's tied up. Most stores, I promise you, north of 60, where there's road access, they don't have a year's supply of all goods in their warehouses for their community. It's not good business practice. Most businesses couldn't afford to do that. But that's actually how we have to operate. And those warehouses often have to be heated because you can't have tin goods get frozen. There's a whole bunch of things. Paint can't be frozen. I mean, they just don't weather that well in minus 40 conditions. So the ability of being able to sort of ship up goods, year round, construction materials and dog food and pasta and rice and all that stuff, could lower the cost of doing business, could lower the cost of living, and also, again, help the mining sector who wants, to bring in year-round goods because they have the same exact problem. So the point of, I guess the work that I'm involved in is sort of going, we need to think differently. The way that we've been doing, I guess, infrastructure investment or not, the way that we've been forced to do business, the way that we've been forced to live, is actually results in a whole bunch of, unfortunately, lack of economic development opportunities, high rates of poverty, high rates of food insecurity. I mean, we've effectively created, and I hate saying this because it breaks my heart, effectively ghettos in our Arctic regions, when you have 8 out of 10 Nunavut Inuit preschool children are food insecure. And almost every Inuit household has preschool children. So it is absolutely immoral, and we can't continue this madness of the way that we have invested in the North and not resulted in much, much better outcomes, much more equitable sort of, equitable outcomes for people, being able to have access to good health care, even if it's e-health and e-commerce, and developing the economies that we desperately need. So maybe in closing, is that especially with NORAD modernization, I'm thrilled to pieces that the silver lining is that, both Canada and the United States are going to be investing, billions of dollars for much needed infrastructure in our respective northern regions. And I see that as a massive opportunity to not just see that investment be, just defense focused only. And I'm also equally happy to hear that both, the Canadian and U.S. military and defense sector saying, we want multi-purpose or dual-purpose infrastructure. We want this infrastructure not just to, be useful for securing national security, but that it's good for the communities, and because what the communities need is what we need. It's good for the resource sector. And that, there really is an opportunity to do it right. For the first time, I think that, we have that sort of like political will out of necessity. But the last thing I want to see, which happened, in the Cold War, is that we built out the dew line sites or early warning systems, infrastructure that had my people literally feeding off the dumps of the U.S. Waste. That is not what we want to happen with this infrastructure. We want to see it unlock, the economic opportunities that allows us to develop digital economies, the blue economy, The subsea fiber optic cable could have sensors on it, and all of a sudden we can do science and monitoring and telecommunications. We can get the marine intelligence data that the military so desperately wants for all domain awareness and for continental defense. But that also, it's good for environmental protection. It's good for climate change monitoring. It's good for, giving us, our people, the jobs because those sensors need to be maintained. So again, it's just all about let's do it smart, let's be more strategic, and as a result, we will see much, much better outcomes and unlock the rich opportunity that exists in our north, and at the same, time, protect it for our national security interests. Does that sound a little bit too passionate and a little bit too?
I'm ready to do this.
It's a bent of overdue necessity. Okay.
You can move it too.
Oh, it says don't move it.
So now I guess I'm going to have Jessica talk about how and why we need to finance this.
So, I'll be the other half of the bookend here. But before I get into it, Madeline, is it called the High Arctic Haulers? Because you were talking about the supply ships, and is that the name of the show?
Oh yes, Arctic haulers.
Okay, so there's a show that everyone should watch, and it's about the high Arctic haulers. But so first of all, it dramatizes like the supply ships that come into the Canadian North every year, and what they go through just to arrive, if they arrive at all. But also there's a real nice context to it as well, because it talks about the relationship between the stuff that's being hauled and the people on the receiving end of that, and that relationship to how important it is for them to get their goods, and the reliance that is on these supply ships. So I'll just say that. Anyways, so I'm president and CEO of Arctic 360. We're Canada's premier Arctic think tank. We're nonpartisan, and basically we were created because we wanted to be able to elevate the national conversation about the Arctic at home, of course, and then use this as a platform for Canada to engage on the global stage. And I think much of what Madeline has been talking about is the reason why the conversation needs to be elevated in Canada. There's a real lack of knowledge, understanding, nuance on behalf of a lot of Canadians about the opportunities but the obstacles that can be overcome, and what we're doing to move towards finding a brighter future, let's say. So I'm just going to focus and kind of pick up and round it up on just two specific points. So basically, a bit on the investment angle. I could go much deeper into it, but I won't. And the will. And about the will, we could say that we might finally be here and have the will. It's unfortunate to a war. But overall in the North American Arctic, we really have this long-standing, and I'd say more Canada, U.S., and lesser today, Greenland, this long-standing stereotype when it comes to development and just building things in the Arctic. Everything is impossible. It's too windy, it's too cold, it's too dark, it's too remote, and the reasons go on, and it's kind of a defeatist attitude. But today, we're seeing our Nordic Arctic neighbors. They're using actually their Arctic to actually do big and great things, new innovations. And it's precisely because they're using the cold, the wind, the dark, the remote, and that kind of environment to create new innovations. So I guess we can ask, is it the North American Arctic's time? Is it time for things to happen here? And, like what's been mentioned, we do have this kind of interesting intersection of things happening. So if I can use this axis word, but we have on one axis, let's say, the emergence of like these technologies, which Madeline has been talking about. And, these are big ideas, and they're big ideas actually made to fit for the Arctic, precisely because the Arctic is remote and precisely because of its weather, because of climate change, et cetera. And then on this other axis, which is coming to intersect with the former, is in the North American Arctic at this moment, we have a need, and today we have a will in the face of current geopolitics. And so we know there will be substantial federal dollars that are going to be invested into NORAD modernization. But we also know that building really all that we need is going to require private investment as well. And so this kind of brings me to my second point, the investment angle. So the government has, we could say at the outset, an important role to play in helping to attract private investment on a number of fronts. Like I said, I won't get too much into them, but basically it's strategy, helping to build the business cases, creating incentive mechanisms, like, for example, backstopping projects. And when it comes specific to strategy, within that, we need to identify short, medium, and long-term infrastructure needs. But this kind of, let's say, roadmap requires, though, knowing where are we going. So what's the goal? What's the vision? And I won't, and I'll say, in Canada, this is something for us, we need to figure out what our vision is and our plan. But I guess we can also ask that question, in terms of whose vision. Is it also maybe time to think about a North American Arctic vision when we're thinking strategy and infrastructure and how to build it all? And so I'll also say that while we have a renewed, this kind of like the Russian threat which occupies much of the discussion today, we cannot base all of our infrastructure needs from the short to the long term on the current geopolitics, right, of the war in Ukraine. And therefore only think about infrastructure needs from this defense perspective. So we also have infrastructure needs, I was brought up, when it comes to building Canada's critical mineral economy. And in these cases, defense infrastructure, might not be the most important kinds of infrastructure, but certainly critical minerals is an issue of national security. So, it's seemingly then impossible to talk about, building these new supply chains, what to build, where, completely disconnected from a conversation, I would say, about infrastructure needed for NORAD modernization. And to that end, the same needs to be said then about northern communities and the infrastructure needs there, which have been really detailed and outlined. I mean, no one could say it better than I think Madeline. And so to that, this kind of past idea, this idea about trickle-down infrastructure, I think it's outdated and it's no longer really acceptable. There's just no guarantee that, you build a bunch of defense investments that it's going to automatically benefit the communities. And I think we've learned that that clearly has failed in the past. So then what does this mean? Well, if we want to get it right, infrastructure investments, clearly they just need to be coordinated. They need to be strategic. It requires building what we've been talking about, multi-purpose and multi-user infrastructure. But to do this, of course, requires a vision, then the roadmap and the private capital to get there, of which private capital, though, wants to see a vision and a roadmap. And in terms of private capital, which I would say includes everything from venture capital to patient capital, kind of then just brings me to my last few final words. So, we know that what we need to build needs to be state of the art, right? We're not going to build a port that was designed in the 1940s, the late 1940s or something, or the 1950s. It needs to be based on next generation infrastructure and technologies. And so that's why these smart cable fibers, SMRs, airships, these are exactly the kinds of examples of thinking about how we need to, they have an important role to play and they need to be taken into consideration when we're trying to figure out what we need and how people, goods, everything gets from A to B. And they also, though, I think demonstrate that big things are possible in the North American Arctic. And, frankly, if MIT researchers were able to figure out, which they have, how to make 3D printed houses on the moon, we should just be able to build what we need to do here on Earth in our Arctic. And really, it comes down to we just need to be strategic because we need to build social, economic, and defense infrastructure that the region needs. And of course, this requires, though, ultimately, a strategy, but the will. And so we don't yet have a strategy, but, do we have the will? Is this the time where we finally might have the will to do something different than what we've done before? I'll just end with this. Madeline's favorite thing that she always says to me is, the definition of insanity is just doing the same thing over and over again, so.
And expecting different outcomes.
And expecting different outcomes. So are we all insane, or are we going to do something?
Do you have any questions, or do you want me to just pipe in?
Yeah, you can pipe in if you want.
Well, thank you guys. It's a pleasure to hear you both and the passion. I think everyone can see the passion. Maybe just to start off the discussion, a few of my own comments and what you've heard. When I say something like, we should have airships, people think you're crazy. And maybe that's the craziest. I think people get fiber, but there's always the question of the expense. And then SMRs, again, the question of the expense and the question of the social license, that uranium and nuclear is not that popular in the North. And in fact, there's been many of the international efforts have been to create a nuclear-free zone in essence. And what does this mean for that? So I just want to, first, I'll address how I've thought of these and some of the common, hesitations and how I thought these could be overcome. And then maybe you guys can as well, Madeline. I'm sure you've heard them all. But on the airship side, I just want, this technology is not new. It has existed for a long time. But to point out that it is basically GHG-free air transport. And so from a purely climate change perspective, that's obviously very important. It is not only important for the communities, and no one could be more eloquent than Madeline in creating an image in your mind of why, year-round transport of cargo is important. But for things like taking out rare earths, the platinums, silver, gold, diamonds, not all critical minerals, but other things that also make money, that it actually makes sense to use airships as compared to building a railroad or a road on melting permafrost. And so our airships, can they be expensive? Yes. But my mind was turned with a Quebec mining company that did the analysis comparing building a 150-kilometer road versus getting an airship. And the slam dunk was on the side of the airships. That the problem with the regulatory side is a linear project. Any linear project is going to be difficult. It might affect caribou migration routes. It will affect different territories versus simply having, a hangar in one community going to a hangar in another community. So not only the year-round, but a far less carbon footprint and a far less land footprint. And from the perspective of the mining company, whereas they would be responsible for building a single-use road in many cases, have to remediate it after 30 years, have to maintain it on melting permafrost or on swamp or on tundra. In this case, they can simply lease. And so their investment costs up front, if they have to raise, say, $4 billion for a mine, well, that's $1 billion less that they have to raise for not having to build that road. That is just an annual operating thing. So there is a very good business case, is what I want to say. I'm more of a small government kind of person, and I don't really want to see, so much more money coming into the North. The problem hasn't been the money. The problem has been the strategy, I think, in general. So that's on the airship sides. On the SMRs, are they too expensive today? Yes, they're too expensive today. But I think, the SMR announcements are coming almost weekly now. And even at the microreactor size. And the safety is being built in. People worry about terrorism. The very small modular reactors get buried. One reason you might need fiber is to keep an eye on it. So there's, that redundancy. But this will get cheaper. And when Madeline says that Iqaluit is already spending $150 million a year on diesel, all of a sudden SMRs, microreactors, don't sound that expensive. And they need to be refueled about every 15 years. And uranium is actually a pretty cheap fuel because it is so powerful and compact. And so, for example, in Canada, when they said last week, Ring of Fire, our great critical minerals development is taking so long. It's on a swamp in northern Ontario with no roads and no electricity. Those are some big burdens for a mining company. Well, SMRs and airships can frankly overcome a lot of those challenges. And so it really unleashes all this geological potential that we have. And then finally, fiber. And in my former life, I spent a lot of time on distance education and distance healthcare. And these are things, I think, which we all appreciate now, like I say, after COVID, are very critical parts and can make things cheaper and more accessible, more affordable kinds of elements. But it is very frustrating. It is not reliable enough in the North to do healthcare by the North. Certain types of healthcare that we can do, that I could call my doctor now, cannot be done yet. So the place where you need it the most, the place where you would need that telehealth or that, teleeducation the most, cannot be done with our current infrastructure. Same with distance education, where you have multiple small communities. This is many rural communities. The frustration of being a student and getting cut off from your instructor, it makes it too much of a burden for the student. And so you aren't able to build that capacity. You have to either ship them to Iqaluit or to Ottawa or Toronto to get education, or more likely they just simply don't get education. From a mining perspective, there isn't enough labor force for all the mines that we want to build. They will have to do some remote work. And so again, to work on the robotics, to work on a remote workforce, having that fiber connection to a mine is going to allow them to actually be able to run the mine, which they cannot do with the labor that we have available now. So again, a great business case that mining companies are already looking at. If we could have some government state funding for some of this, that would be great. But even more important is a regulatory system that allows this to happen at pace, that allows SMRs to be put at pace, that allows fiber connectivity put in pace, and allows the regulation of air transport by airship, which doesn't yet exist, and the pilots for airships allows that to happen. And so at the very least, if government doesn't want to fund all these, at least put in place a system that private industry can put in place. And I will say one last thing, which is probably what you're going to talk about. We're already spending billions of dollars on these things as federal governments, state governments. And so why don't we spend it in a way that actually produces good outcomes, that 8 out of 10 preschool children aren't starving?
So, I'm really glad that you acknowledge that airships is actually not a new technology. It's just a new application. And we need to recognize is that we do want to seriously reduce the amount of carbon emissions that we are having. We've got carbon tax in Canada that is effectively both a carrot and a stick, in so much as that it penalizes anything that is driving, the more use of fossil fuels and more greenhouse gas emission. And what I would like to see is the ability of, instead of paying just simply the carbon tax as a penalty, is that if you have a plan in place, like a mine that, is bringing in a ton of petroleum product, is demonstrate that you need to be allowed to bank that, penalty tax towards actually being able to deploy, some real solutions. So that may be sort of like, we want and will commit to an SMR, or we want and will commit to possibly using, a better form of transportation like airships. And that allows that incentivizes maybe that set aside money for actually a proper sort of plan for those mines or communities that are currently, very, very dependent on fossil fuel and with no real other source of income or financing to do that. Also, there's the whole problem with ice roads melting, and that's another sort of significant risk of those communities that have no other sort of way of getting those large construction materials or large, a school bus into their communities. And finding, again, that right sort of business case. It's not a question of, if airships are going to come and actually be a new form of transportation of major cargo goods. It's a question of where and when and under what business circumstances. So not just in Canada's north, it may be a solution in other remote parts of the world. That's Africa, that's Australia. There are other business cases for that. Again, just maybe want to just do a couple little corrections. So right now, Iqaluit is spending about $264 million a year on fossil fuel. And that the SMRs that are in development are looking at a 25-year lifespan. Mm-hmm. So when you do the economics, it does actually make a lot of sense. And you've got companies like Ultrasafe Nuclear Corporation, which is a US-based company, in partnership with Ontario Power Generation, who are actually now at phase 2 at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories to try to actually move ahead in developing a commercialized product in the next 5 years. So again, it's not a question of if this technology is, going to happen. It's a question of where and when and under what circumstances, is the good business case. We know that there are, at least in Canada, billions of dollars of infrastructure investments that are going to be made. And in the north right now, in most of the infrastructure investments, the federal government's prepared to put 75 cents in on the dollar, and the private sector or the provincial or territorial or municipal government has to find that other 25. So that formula is really attractive, but we again, 25% of $250 million is still a big chunk of coin. So it has to make economic sense. I want to stress too is that as we see these projects, potentially being conceptualized, and the value and the need for the strategy that Jessica so eloquently spoke of, is that we want and to ensure that Indigenous and Northern communities and peoples and businesses are part of that equation. We want to find ways in which to use some of our own cash or capital equity, or to see some of the government investments converted into Indigenous equity. And so that again, moving away from the concept of instead of IBAs, which stands for benefit agreements, impact benefit agreements, is actually moving towards IPAs, which are basically Indigenous partnership agreements, so that we are actually part owners of the infrastructure that's going to be built. We're going to learn how to manage it and operate it, and do it in a better, more holistic way, create jobs for our communities, rather than targets of southern businesses, hoping to train some of our people and employ some of our people. And then I think the last thing I really wanted to speak about is, the fiber optic cables aren't just good for telecommunications. There is a Norwegian company called Bulk that actually wants to build its second fiber optic cable from Norway into Happy Valley Goose Bay. And the reason why we got really interested in that and adjusted our original, cable route for Sednalink to instead of going from Newfoundland, sort of island, is because twofold. One is their fiber optic cable is actually not so much the traditional telecommunications cable. They're not going to provide, services like the way Bell or Horizon do. Rather, their business model is about unlocking the renewable energy, abundant renewable energy that exists in Norway, and wanting to unlock the opportunity for abundant renewable energy in northern Labrador and for data centers. And as Ole, who owns the company, says, it's cheaper to move a gigabit of data than a gigawatt. So instead of having the data centers in places like Boston or, Newark or, San Francisco, is actually having them in northern remote regions because they're so energy intensive. And the reason why we're moving them into the Arctic is because of cool temperatures. And so it still requires a lot of energy, but less of it. And so being able to, I was meeting this morning with Polarctic, who's in the AI business in Alaska, and recognizing that, this is where it's all happening. We can create Arctic digital, infrastructure, and we can create Arctic digital economies and create Arctic blue economies. So it's so exciting, to see the way in which we can unlock, these innovative solutions that creates these economies that are not only good for, the North is actually in some ways also a really secure place in which to actually have some of these critical infrastructure for our countries. So I'm really excited about, having integrated solutions or integrated strategies, and that at the end of the day, as Heather said, these investments are going to be made. And the ones that we've been made to date have just failed in being, not as strategic or not as beneficial as they could and should have been. And so, like the Iqaluit port, and I'm glad we're getting a deep sea port, but it's not a year-round one. If we wanted, a transformative investment, what we would have done with the Iqaluit port is we would have built a road down the bay to where it's open water year-round, and then voila. It would have been a transformative investment for decades and centuries. And then similarly, that port was built for current users. So we're not even talking about ports of like decades ago. In 2020 and 2022, the port that we're building, we didn't have our government actually speak to the fishery sector. We didn't have them speak to the tourism cruise sector. We didn't have them speak to the defense sector. And it's like, why not? So that's an investment, because ideally, what would have the port, look like? And ideally, even thinking, bigger and better, a smart port. That's where the world is going with their ports, is that digitalization of the ports and how you better manage ship traffic, how you better manage the delivery of that cargo, and how you'd be able to do things like, instead of right now, Nunavut unloads all our fish in Nucor in eastern Canada, is unloaded in Iqaluit, process it in Iqaluit, distribute it from Iqaluit, and that is how you grow those economies instead of being, what we are, is this kind of like welfare state of the North where we have those riches and we have people who desperately want education and training and jobs. And we can do it if we, as I said earlier, we just think and invest differently. And invest not only in the infrastructure, but we need to invest in our people too.
Yeah. I'll just quickly then follow up on a few of these points. So I'm going to speak a little bit maybe to start with the smart cable idea. And okay, at just the most rudimentary level, so the beginning of COVID, this is how bad it is right now, like in Nunavut. At the beginning of COVID in Iqaluit, teachers were having to basically print out coursework and then walk from house to house and deliver it, because there just wasn't any sort of ability to actually have class online. And so that's the state of affairs today compared to, let's say, the rest of Canada and the OECD. Maybe parts of Alaska fit into that bucket, what I was just talking about. But also, in terms of another piece of the smart cable stuff is, for something else, I read a lot of the transcripts from the hearings from the Baffinland mine, and the thing that was repeated over and over again is that there's just basically a complete lack of most baseline data, and there's a complete lack of monitoring systems in place. And so a lot of things are based on, what we think, what we hope, what we were worried about, and all these kind of things. And having something like a smart cable obviously creates the ability to collect the data, to create the baseline data, and then to help start then, having effective monitoring programs. And monitoring programs that are just not, in effect for 2 years based on something and then kind of die out because the will, the capacity, the funding, what have you, is gone.
You're talking about wildlife monitoring.
All sorts of marine monitoring, but also this defense monitoring goes into that same kind of bucket. But in terms of the Baffinland piece, it's marine monitoring, exactly, but you can also even understand climate change and marine changes overall in terms of the water itself. So there's this piece, and and then just speaking to the smart ports, and this goes back to this conversation about, I know you always need, you said we got to move on to a new conversation about, but it's this narrative, this stereotype about the inability to do things, that big things are not possible in the North. So we did have we've done for several years these dialogues with the Coast Guard and northern communities. And I thought one year, and it's to talk about shipping and infrastructure, basically, what we need in the North for in terms of just marine infrastructure. And I decided to have some specialists come in to talk about smart ports, because the world is going towards smart ports, and at some point you're not going to be able to bring a boat to a place that doesn't have a connected port to the boat, right? And again, we don't want to build like a 1950s big cement thing that's no longer relevant. But the problem, and this is where we just got to get out from under this feeling of defeatist mentality. So those experts gave their presentations, and there was a lot of kind of the comments that were received from some of the communities were like, oh, yeah, but okay, we're not going to go down that road. We want this big, fancy, crazy port and all these things, like if we want to do, if we are talking about that, we'll never get anything. Like we just need something, like we just need anything. And it's like, that's where the bar is. Like, and I don't think that's fair or necessary for people to think that they should just be able to get whatever they can get, right? Like, why can't we think big? Of course we can. It's just we have to be able to have the will and have the leadership to have that sort of mentality about, like, we can do this and it's possible, and there's huge positive outcomes to be had from it, generational. benefits. So that's about that.
I'll quickly intervene to say that we're approaching the end of our allotted time here. We've had several questions come in online for you all, but the both of you have brilliantly answered most of them, so good job with there. With that in mind, maybe just a couple wrapping up thoughts from all three of you as we, go towards the end of the event.
Are there any questions in the audience?
I got one. Yeah, airships to the Arctic. That's been around for 20 years, right? Barry Prentice at Manitoba.
He's still the guy.
Right. so what's taking so long?
Yeah.
What's the downside? Because there's got to be a downside, but I'm not hearing it.
So I think where we're finally at is that sort of we've got Government of Canada funding to do the pre-feasibility study. There's actually 2 airship studies that are sort of happening in parallel, and we want to make sure that they're not just duplicative, but they're complementary. One is looking primarily at the technological aspects, which, as I said, those are being all worked out, and I'm not worried about that. It's just, where do they now make economic sense? The fuel prices are going through the roof, and we can see that that's, and the energy security component in question is not just the fact of, can we get the fossil fuel? For us, it's the price. And we've got the icebreaker in Iqaluit right now in early December, and I've never seen that in memory. I've never seen the fact that the icebreaker is there because it's actually helping refuel the community to try to ensure that we've got enough fuel until the next open water. So I'm really excited because I think, the SMRs, again, it's not new technology. It's a new approach to historical technology. We're used to almost something similar to SMRs on the U.S. What are they called? Those big air carrier craft ships, right? And submarines and the Mars rover. These are new applications for communities and for mines that we've never seen before. So I'm just thrilled that we really are making now these absolutely, the innovation time is now. And it's all coming in the next 5 to 10 years. And we want to see it being used in the North and not just elsewhere in the world. We want to be able to see United States and Canada in partnership, actually not lose out on this market opportunity, because these SMRs and the airships are equally applicable in remote places of Africa and Southeast Asia and Australia. And it is coming. And, it would be sad if we missed out on that.
And maybe I'll answer that in joint with my closing thoughts, because I think they're similar. In airships in particular, but you could probably say it about SMRs and fiber also, is that you probably do need some state funding to kickstart it.
Yep.
And an airship, you need regulation and license for the pilots. You need the hangars, more than one. They can't just make one. They need to make 6. You need the contract for that. And for the last decade, for the last 5 decades, but certainly for the last decade, there was not a lot of government incentive or desire to subsidize resource extraction. It was not popular. There was not a lot of mining investment. So there wasn't even the private industry saying, this is where we want you to put your billions of dollars. But now we're in a different, so is this, now the question is, are we in a different space where there's an incentive, that it's in our strategies, that we know we need the critical minerals, that actually we need industrial policy now? And we're seeing what the Inflation Reduction Act, and is that going to trickle down into the Arctic, where we're going to say, actually, we need this infrastructure and we need it across North America. It will pay for itself over the long term. We need it for our own energy and resource security, not to mention the people. But is it time for what is it that we need to get to a point where we decide we do need industrial policy in the Arctic? But if you use the term industrial policy in the Arctic for the last 15 years, you would not have had an audience. Maybe that audience is changing. And a lot of what we're also trying to do, and Madeline and Jessica are trying to do, is also create that social license. That when Northerners hear industrial policy, that they see benefits for themselves, and this is not just another way to extract from the region without benefits for them. And I'll end my comments there. Maybe Jessica can.
I'll just wrap it up with a little plug on my end. So actually, I invite you all to Toronto the end of February, because we're having our annual conference that we have each year for the last 4 years, I believe. where we're going to actually be talking about these exact issues and conversations. So this year's theme is Tilting the Globe. It's accelerating cooperation, innovation, and opportunity. And so we are going to be talking about the investment piece, multi-user, multi-purpose infrastructure, strategy, innovation, critical minerals. It's all on the on the agenda. So please come join the conversation. Love to have you.
Madeline, any final thoughts?
I think one of the mantras that is often now said by Northerners and Indigenous people who live in the North is nothing about us without us. And so we need to be, part of the conversations, co-developing the policies, co-developing the innovation, co-developing, co-owning the infrastructure that gets built in our regions, because it is good for business. Believe me, that's the only. SMRs aren't going to happen without Indigenous, approval in our regions. Airships, without a doubt. We do have that power to say no, and we want to be in the situation where we actually want to be, there to say yes.
Cool. Well, we want to thank all three of the speakers today for joining us to speak about this important topic, and thank you to those in person here and online for joining this event. With that, we will close out, and thank you from the Wilson Center.